800 hours. July 17th, 1953. Imagine standing in the open door of a vibrating C-47 Dakota transport plane.
Oh, just the sheer noise and the wind in that moment would be overwhelming.
Exactly. And you are looking down at this landscape of jagged, towering, limestone karst mountains. You're about to jump with 2,000 elite paratroopers over 100 kilometers deep behind enemy lines.
And, your objective isn't even to hold ground.
Right. Your objective is to locate and obliterate this massive hidden supply cache buried deep inside a network of ancient caves.
But jumping in is, it's really only the beginning of the nightmare.
Because High Command has put a ticking clock on you. A very, very short one.
Yeah, they have exactly 72 hours to coordinate a relief force.
Yeah.
We're talking 3,000 mechanized troops and a naval task force all having to punch through hostile territory to pull you back out.
And if they don't, the surrounding enemy divisions are going to close the net and completely annihilate your entire force.
It is the absolute definition of a high-stakes, multi-domain military gamble. It really is. You are dropping this airborne scalpel into the deep rear of an enemy that is rapidly transitioning into a conventional army. You're betting everything on speed, surprise, and honestly, a highly precarious extraction plan.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack Operation Hirondelle, or Operation Swallow.
Which is just this fleeting, blazing moment of sheer tactical brilliance, right?
Yeah, but set against the incredibly grim, steadily deteriorating landscape of the French Indochina War.
A very dark period for the French forces, absolutely.
And to guide us through the microscopic margins of error in this operation, we are relying on an absolutely phenomenal, immersive research study by Mick Prichter.
Yes, his work is just incredible. You can find his incredibly detailed research at battlefieldtravels.com.
Mick's methodology is really what makes this research so compelling. I mean, when you are analyzing an operation this complex, you can't just rely on broad, high-level summaries.
No, you have to get into the weeds. He went straight to the primary unit histories, specifically the meticulous records of modern successor units, like the 6th RPIMA and the 2nd RAP.
But more importantly, he didn't just sit in an archive. He physically traveled to Vietnam. He walked the modern battlefield himself.
Which is vital. I mean, you cannot understand military history without understanding the dirt, the elevation, the lines of sight.
Right, the actual physical geometry of the space. But Mick took it even further because original reliable maps detailing the exact parachute drop zones for this specific operation are basically scarce to non-existent.
They're essentially ghost maps at this point. So he utilized Geographic Information Systems, or GIS terrain analysis.
Which is so cool. He took these black and white photographs snapped by the actual paratroopers on the morning of the 1953 drop.
Yeah, and he noted the specific jagged horizon views, the distinct shapes of those limestone mountains in the background.
When he tested those angles against modern digital topography in Google Earth Pro.
It's a brilliant application of technology. By matching the historical 1953 horizon lines to the modern digital 3D models, he was able to triangulate the exact location.
Pinpointing the exact unmapped drop zones used by the assault force. It completely grounds the historical narrative in absolute physical reality.
It strips away all the mythology and shows us the actual geometry of the battlefield. It's fascinating.
So to really understand why the French High Command would authorize something as wildly risky as Operation Hirondelle, we have to set the strategic board.
We need to look at the dark days of 1952 and 1953.
Because the context here is this creeping realization that the French Far East Expeditionary Corps is just bleeding out.
Precisely. By the summer of 1953, the illusion that the French were going to achieve a quick, decisive colonial victory in Indochina had completely evaporated.
It was gone. The entire strategic posture had been fundamentally compromised.
And to understand how they got backed into that terrifying corner, you have to trace the geography of the disaster back to October 1950.
Route Coloniale 4.
Yes, exactly. The French suffered a catastrophic defeat along Route Coloniale 4, commonly known as RC4.
This was just a nightmare of a road, right? A winding, treacherous mountain road that shadowed the Chinese border.
It was essentially a continuous ambush zone. The event is known to history as the Cao Bang Ridge disaster. In a matter of weeks, the French lost control of the entire northern border region with China.
Including the vital garrison town of Langsun.
Right. And when the French military abandoned Langsun on October 17, 1950, the retreat was so incredibly chaotic that they had to leave behind thousands of tons of material.
Weapons, artillery, ammunition, vital supplies, all just left in the mud.
But the loss of the physical equipment wasn't even the worst part.
Losing RC-4 in Lang Son fundamentally changed the physics of the war.
It was a massive paradigm shift. Once the Viet Minh controlled that northern border region, the geographical barrier was gone entirely.
They suddenly had a direct, unhindered, porous pipeline to their political and military allies.
Exactly, directly into Communist China and the Soviet Union. This is the exact moment the Viet Minh began to transform.
They stopped being a purely localized, lightly armed guerrilla insurgency fighting from the shadows.
And they begin evolving into a conventional, heavily armed military force, one that is highly capable of large-scale, sustained logistical operations.
And the French, they feel the devastating weight of that transformation almost immediately, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. In late 1952, the Viet Minh launched their massive Northwest campaign, what the Vietnamese refer to as Chinh Thang Thai Bắc.
They mobilize entire divisions and just roll right over the French defenses, sweeping through the Thai highlands and completely overrunning the area bordering Laos.
The French High Command was in a state of near panic at this point. Their response was Operation Lorraine,
which at that time was the largest single French military operation of the entire war.
They amassed this massive mechanized and infantry force and pushed deep into Viet Minh-controlled territory. They were aggressively seeking to force a decisive, pitched battle.
They wanted to use their superior firepower to crush the Viet Minh main force out in the open, like a classic European battle.
But the Viet Minh didn't play by those rules. They didn't mass their forces to be slaughtered by French artillery.
No, they just melted away into the dense jungle canopy.
They traded space for time. They stretched the French supply lines along these miserable, muddy roads until they reached the absolute breaking point.
And then, once the French were totally overextended, the Viet Minh aggressively ambushed their vulnerable columns.
Operation Lorraine ultimately ended in a desperate, bloody fighting withdrawal through the narrow confines of the Chan Mung Pass.
It was a stark demonstration that the French conventional mechanized tactics were completely failing in this environment.
The only real bright spot for the French military in all of 1952 was their successful defense of the base at Nha San in November and December.
And Nha San is a really interesting concept, because it wasn't a traditional fort, it was an airland base.
Right. Exactly. The French essentially carved a fortified hedgehog defense straight out of the jungle, built entirely around an airstrip.
Because the roads were too dangerous, so they had to supply the garrison completely by air.
They dug in, fortified the surrounding hills, and effectively dared the Viet Minh to attack it.
And when the Viet Minh did attack, the French relied heavily on concentrated artillery fire and close air support to break those human wave assaults. Nha San held.
It did hold, but even though Nha San held, it was still just a static defensive victory.
Right. It didn't stop the overall strategic bleeding across the rest of the theater.
Because by early 1953, the Viet Minh offensives are continuing to push deeper into northern Laos. They're directly threatening the Plain of Jars and the royal capital city of Luang Prabang.
And ominously, they even overran the small original French garrison at a remote border town called Dien Bien Phu.
Everywhere you look on the strategic map in 1953, these small, isolated French outposts in the highlands are fighting desperate, doomed defensive actions.
They're being surrounded, starved of supplies, and eventually wiped out.
The map is shrinking rapidly. The safe zones are vanishing.
It really reminds me of reading about the Roman legions losing the Teutoburg forest in ancient Germany.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
There's this terrifying, creeping realization that the periphery of the empire can no longer be held. The frontier is collapsing inward.
The vast, dark forest is suddenly full of an enemy that is drastically stronger, better armed, and more organized than your intelligence ever projected.
You are being methodically pushed back toward your coastal strongholds and the safety of your naval guns.
That shrinking map and that creeping dread you just described, it forced a massive structural shakeup in the French High Command.
They desperately needed a circuit breaker.
So on May 27th, 1953, General Henri Navarre arrives in theater. He replaces Raoul Salan as the commander-in-chief of French forces in Indochina.
And Navarre brings an entirely new staff, fresh eyes, and crucially, a brand new political mandate from Paris.
Because the goalposts for victory had completely moved.
Drastically. I mean, the catastrophic tactical losses and the sheer financial drain of 1952 had fundamentally shifted French political will.
The objective was no longer to win the war outright through total military conquest. That was off the table.
Navarre's specific mandate was to generate enough military leverage to inflict enough localized pain and logistical disruption on the Viet Minh.
To stall their momentum and force them to the negotiating table under conditions that wouldn't be completely humiliating to France.
Navarre needed to construct a military lever to pry open a diplomatic door.
And to create that leverage, Navarre couldn't just sit in his coastal strongholds. He needed an instrument that could strike fast, deep, and incredibly hard.
Which brings us to the uniquely bold and hyper-aggressive way the French utilized their airborne forces in Indochina.
We are not talking about holding paratroopers back as some precious strategic reserve for one massive drop a year.
Right. The French Foreign Legion, the Colonial Paratroopers, the Metropolitan Battalions, and the Vietnamese airborne units, they executed over 160 combat jumps during this war.
160 combat jumps is a staggering operational tempo. I mean, to put that in perspective, many paratroopers in World War II might make 1 or 2 combat jumps in their entire career.
Yeah, maybe 3 if they were in the thick of it from the start. But the French in Indochina were utilizing airborne forces as an everyday tactical tool.
If a road was cut, if an outpost was surrounded, if a valley needed sweeping, they just dropped paratroopers directly onto the tactical objective.
It required a level of physical endurance and operational aggression from the paratroopers that is honestly hard to overstate.
And General Navarre's intelligence department, the Deuxième Bureau in Hanoi, suddenly hands him the absolute perfect target for this aggressive airborne instrument.
The target is Lang Son.
The very same town the French had disastrously lost during that chaotic retreat of 1950.
Exactly. Since the French abandoned it, the Viet Minh had transformed Lang Son and the surrounding region into a massive, heavily guarded logistical hub.
This was the primary artery. The intelligence revealed that the enemy had stockpiled an unimaginable amount of supplies.
Hidden deep inside the massive natural limestone karst caves of Ky Lua, which is located just north of the town itself.
We have to talk about the physical terrain of those caves, because limestone karst is a nightmare for an attacking force.
Yeah, these aren't just holes dug in the dirt. Karst formations are these towering, jagged mountains of solid rock.
They are completely riddled with vast, cavernous internal networks. It's like a natural fortress.
You could drop heavy aerial bombs on these mountains all day long, and the rock is so thick that the munitions and supplies hidden deep inside the caverns wouldn't even rattle.
You absolutely cannot destroy a karst cave complex from the air. You have to put infantry on the ground to physically walk inside and blow it up from the inside out.
And that is the central problem. It is the central nervous system of the Viet Minh supply line flowing from the Chinese border directly down into the combat zones of the Red River Delta.
But hitting it with infantry seems completely impossible because Lang Son is situated over 100 kilometers deep into hostile, enemy-held territory.
But then, the Deuxième Bureau gets the intelligence coup of the year.
Oh, this was a massive breakthrough. They discover that the Viet Minh regular division that is actively guarding the Lang Son area is scheduled to rotate out of the sector.
On the morning of July 16th, 1953. But here is the critical vulnerability.
Their relief division is delayed by logistical friction. They won't arrive to take over those defensive positions for another 2 days.
General Navarre is suddenly staring at a 48-hour window where the massive strategic supply dump at Ky Lua is virtually unguarded by frontline combat troops.
It is a fleeting golden opportunity, a massive gap in the armor.
But I have to push back here, thinking about this from a strategic command perspective.
Sure, go ahead.
Is dropping a highly specialized force of 2,000 light infantrymen over 100 kilometers deep into enemy territory based solely on a 48-hour intelligence gap brilliant? Or is it a catastrophic hubristic gamble?
It's a fair question. It's incredibly risky.
Because when you look at the mechanics of this, it sounds terrifyingly similar to the British airborne dropping at Arnhem in Operation Market Garden during the Second World War.
You know, the classic bridge too far scenario.
Exactly. You are dropping light infantry with limited ammunition, completely cut off from the main army, banking on the prayer that a mechanized relief column can punch through dozens of miles of hostile roads to save them.
All before the enemy surrounds and completely annihilates them.
The echoes of Market Garden are absolutely there, and the risk of annihilation was deeply understood by the French command.
But you really have to view this through the lens of Navarre's calculated risk. To stall the Viet Minh's momentum, to disrupt their transition from a guerrilla force into a conventional army, he had to strike their logistics.
You can't just fight their infantry in the jungle. You have to starve their artillery and their heavy weapons of ammunition.
Right. But Lang Son is far too deep for a conventional mechanized ground assault. A heavy armored column would have to fight for weeks just to push up RC-4.
By which time the Viet Minh would simply pack up the supplies in the caves and move them somewhere else.
Exactly. The broadsword couldn't reach the target, so Navarre was forced to throw the dagger. The paratroopers were literally the only viable scalpel.
So he decides to throw the dagger. Let's dig into how you actually design a tactical masterpiece to ensure that dagger hits the target.
And destroys the objective, and crucially, doesn't get utterly destroyed in the process.
Right. General Navarre's staff rapidly developed this staggeringly complex, multi-domain operational plan. The raid force commander selected for this is Lieutenant-Colonel Paul Ducournau,
who commands the Northern Airborne Troops, or TAPN.
And the assault force he puts together is basically an absolute who's who of elite, battle-hardened French paratroopers.
The assault force is built around two legendary units and their highly experienced commanders. First, you have Major Marcel Bigeard commanding the 6th Colonial Parachute Battalion, the 6th BPC.
And jumping right alongside him is Captain Pierre Tourret commanding the 8th Parachute Commando Group, the 8th GCP.
And importantly, because they are going after a hardened cave complex, they are joined by a specialized parachute engineers section, the SGP,
who are jumping in with the heavy explosives required to actually demolish the target. We really need to pause and talk about Major Marcel Bigeard.
Oh, absolutely. You can't really understand French airborne operations in Indochina without understanding his ethos.
By the summer of 1953, Bigeard already possessed a mythic status within the military. Back in October 1952, he led this epic, grueling, against all odds fighting withdrawal from a mountain outpost called Ky Lua.
He and his paratroopers found themselves completely surrounded by an overwhelming force of Viet Minh regulars.
And instead of surrendering, Bigeard somehow managed to march and fight his men out of the encirclement.
They fought a running rearguard action for days, carrying their heavily wounded on improvised stretchers over brutal, mountainous jungle terrain.
Constantly breaking through enemy ambushes. It's just unbelievable endurance.
Bigeard was the absolute embodiment of the tough, relentless, uncompromising paratrooper. His harrowing experience at Ky Lua proved to high command that he wasn't just an aggressive officer who knew how to jump out of a plane.
He was a commander who possessed the sheer tactical grit to survive and extract his men from mathematically impossible situations.
If you are planning to send a force 100 kilometers behind enemy lines with the full, sobering knowledge that they're going to have to walk themselves out of hell on foot, Marcel Bigeard is exactly the commander you want standing at the front of that column.
Right, because dropping in is the relatively easy part. The real terrifying nightmare of Operation Hirondelle is the extraction plan.
And this is where the complexity of the operation just spirals into the stratosphere.
The entire plan relies on a perfectly synchronized dance of completely different military domains. To ensure that the door remains open for Bigeard and Tourret to escape back to friendly lines, a completely separate secondary airborne drop has to happen.
Captain Albert Merglen's 2nd Foreign Legion Parachute Battalion, the 2nd BEP.
They're tasked with jumping 20 kilometers southeast of Lang Son into a town called Loc Binh. Their sole job is to seize the town, sit on Route Coloniale 4, and physically hold the road open against enemy counterattacks.
They are essentially jumping in to act as a human bridgehead, a heavily armed waypoint that the main assault force has to reach on foot.
But the 2nd BEP are just light infantry too. They can't hold that road forever against regular divisions.
So simultaneously, while the paratroopers are dropping from the sky over Lang Son and Loc Binh, a mechanized armored column is going to launch a massive 200-kilometer thunder run.
This is designated Groupe Mobile 5, commanded by Lieutenant-Colonel Jean Raberin and making up the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 5th Foreign Legion Infantry Regiment.
They are going to mobilize their half-tracks and trucks, drive all the way along the coast to a seaport called Tien Yen,
then violently pivot northwest, punch through whatever Viet Minh resistance is blocking the road, and drive up RC-4 to Loc Binh.
To meet the paratroopers, load them into the trucks, and physically carry them out to the sea, where a French naval task force will be waiting to evacuate everyone.
It is a phenomenal logistical chain. And just to add one final insurance policy to the board, High Command kept a strategic reserve.
The 1st Regiment of Parachute Light Infantry?
Right, sitting on the tarmac on 30 minutes' notice, fully rigged and ready to fly in and reinforce the drop if everything went completely sideways.
Just think about the sheer friction involved in coordinating this. You are trying to synchronize 3 different parachute battalions dropping in 2 different locations.
A mechanized armored column fighting its way up a mountain road, and a naval extraction force waiting on the coast. And you were doing all of this in 1953.
We need to talk about 1953 radio communications because they are using heavy, backpack-mounted SCR-300 radios.
Which are notoriously finicky. They rely on fragile vacuum tubes that require heavy, cumbersome batteries.
And most importantly, they operate on line-of-sight frequencies. When you are operating in towering limestone karst valleys during the humid monsoon season, those radios are incredibly unreliable.
Trying to coordinate this multi-domain ballet without modern satellite communications or GPS is a logistical high-wire act over a flaming canyon.
It is breathtakingly complex. And General Navarre and Lieutenant-Colonel Jean knew that this entire towering house of cards relied entirely on one single factor: speed.
The margins were practically zero.
If any one gear in this massive machine jammed, that 48-hour window of opportunity would violently slam shut.
If the transport planes were delayed by monsoon weather, if the mechanized column hit a blown bridge and stalled,
if the paratroopers got bogged down in a firefight at the caves, if any of that happened, the Viet Minh relief divisions would arrive and 2,000 elite paratroopers would be cut off.
surrounded and entirely annihilated. Speed was their only real armor.
Which brings us to the critical issue of operational security. Because you cannot simply prep 58 C-47 transport planes, load them with 2,000 heavily armed men, and spool up a massive mechanized column without the enemy noticing.
There are Viet Minh informants and spies deeply embedded everywhere in Hanoi. The air bases are constantly being watched.
So, to ensure the element of surprise, the French employ a brilliant deception tactic.
They completely lock down the actual assault battalions, the 6th BPC and the 8th GCP, keeping them restricted to their barracks, completely out of sight.
But to mask the massive logistical buildup of aircraft and supplies, they take other non-essential airborne elements and heavily parade them publicly.
In a grandiose, highly visible Bastille Day parade through the streets of Hanoi on July 14th.
It is a textbook misdirection operation. You feed the enemy intelligence networks exactly what they expect to see.
A relaxed, ceremonial military patting itself on the back with brass bands and marching troops.
Exactly. While the real striking force is coiled in the shadows, checking their weapons and packing their gear.
The sheer spectacle of the Bastille Day parade lulled the local Viet Minh intelligence apparatus into a false sense of security, making them believe the French were focused on holidays, not deep strike offensives.
And the deception worked flawlessly. Just 3 days later, on the morning of July 17th, at exactly 0800 hours, the quiet morning sky over the Lang Son Valley is suddenly shattered.
By the roar of twin-row radial engines, 58 C-47 Dakotas fly in formation over the target.
The jump lights turn green, and nearly 2,000 paratroopers of the 8th GCP and the 6th BPC hurl themselves out of the doors,
dropping right on top of the unsuspecting Viet Minh rear echelon. And here is a tactical detail that absolutely blew my mind when I was reading Mick Prichter's analysis.
Oh, I know exactly what you're going to say.
For the first time in the entire Indochina War, the paratroopers deliberately abandoned their parachutes in the dirt on the drop zone.
Yes. From a doctrinal standpoint, that is a highly significant operational shift.
I mean, let's look at the mechanics of why that matters. Because normally, in standard airborne doctrine, once a paratrooper hits the ground, they are required to meticulously gather up their silk canopy,
roll it up, and secure it so it can eventually be backloaded, repaired, and reused by the airborne training centers.
Parachutes in the 1950s were incredibly expensive, highly specialized pieces of logistical equipment. The military doesn't just throw them away.
No, absolutely not.
So why on earth, on this specific jump, would they just unclip their harnesses and leave thousands of expensive parachutes rotting in the rice paddies of Lang Son?
Because, as we established, speed was their only armor. The most vulnerable phase of any airborne operation is the reorganization phase.
Those chaotic 30 to 60 minutes immediately after hitting the ground when units are trying to find their officers, consolidate their weapons, and gather their gear.
Gathering up 2,000 massive silk parachutes takes precious hours. It requires men to sweep the drop zone, roll the cumbersome material, and establish a static collection point.
It completely drains your manpower and halts your forward momentum.
General Navarre made a cold, calculated, highly pragmatic trade-off. He willingly traded incredibly expensive logistical equipment for absolute, unadulterated operational momentum.
By officially ordering the men to abandon the Silk, Captain Tourret's 8th GCP was able to instantly form into combat squads.
And rapidly assault the town of Lang Son, while Major Bigeard's 6th BPC sprinted straight for the Ky Lua cave complex.
They literally hit the dirt, popped their harnesses, chambered their weapons, and started moving toward the objective before the last planes had even left the airspace.
Exactly. They completely bypassed the traditional reorganization friction. And the result of that sheer kinetic momentum was staggering.
The Viet Minh rear echelon troops were completely caught off guard.
Within just 2 hours of leaving the aircraft doors, Bigeard's paratroopers had violently secured the limestone cave complex.
And Tourret's commandos had secured the town of Lang Son and its associated logistical warehouses. 2 hours to completely decapitate the logistical hub of an entire region.
So they punch into the caves and the warehouses. What exactly are they finding in the dark that makes this such a vital strategic target?
Because the haul from the fire of Ky Lua is just incredible. They crack open these natural fortresses, and it's an absolute treasure trove of enemy war material.
The inventory they meticulously cataloged before destroying it paints a very clear picture of the enemy's capabilities. Inside the complex, they found 6 Soviet-manufactured Molotova heavy transport trucks.
They found a stockpile of 1,000 freshly greased Czech Skoda machine guns.
They discovered 15,000 liters of aviation and motor gasoline.
Right.
250 brand new heavy-duty truck tires.
Massive stockpiles of Chinese SKZ recoilless rockets, tons of raw food supplies, medical equipment, and fresh uniforms.
And sitting there right in the middle of all this communist bloc weaponry, they found an American-made Bell P-63 King Cobra fighter aircraft.
When you add it all up, the total haul of captured enemy equipment was estimated at around 5,000 tons.
I want to pause on 2 things there. First, the Chinese SKZ recoilless rockets.
Yeah, those are a huge deal.
To understand why finding these was such a massive relief to the French, you have to understand how these weapons work. A recoilless rocket launcher essentially vents the explosive propellant gases out the back of the tube,
Which eliminates the massive recoil that normally comes from firing heavy artillery.
This meant that a small squad of Viet Minh infantrymen could carry a lightweight tube through the jungle and fire massive armor-piercing, bunker-busting shells directly into French concrete fortifications with devastating accuracy.
These rockets were systematically dismantling French outposts across the highlands. Destroying a massive stockpile of them here saved countless French lives.
They were the ultimate equalizer against French static defenses.
And second, the American-made Bell P-63 King Cobra fighter plane. How does a U.S.-manufactured aircraft end up in a Viet Minh cave in northern Indochina?
It likely points back to World War II Lend-Lease programs where the U.S. supplied aircraft to the Soviet Union.
Who then passed them down the proxy chain to China, who handed them across the border to the Viet Minh.
It's the bizarre, sweeping globalization of the Cold War supply chain sitting in a dark cave. You have Soviet trucks, Czech machine guns, Chinese rockets, and an American fighter plane, all staged for a localized conflict in Indochina.
It strongly evokes the multinational arsenals found during the Spanish Civil War, where you'd have German, Italian, and Soviet weapons all clashing in the same muddy trench.
What's truly fascinating is what that level of globalization actually represents on a strategic level. Finding 5,000 tons of heavy foreign-manufactured equipment buried deep in Vietnam definitively proves the absolute porosity of the Chinese border.
After the French lost RC-4 back in 1950.
It proves to General Navarre that the Viet Minh are operating at an industrial, state-sponsored scale. They are no longer scavenging vintage rifles from dead soldiers.
This is a highly organized conventional army receiving massive logistical support from global superpowers.
But there is a glaring physical problem. 2,000 light infantry paratroopers cannot physically carry 5,000 tons of heavy gear back to friendly lines in their rucksacks.
Right. So they have to obliterate it. At exactly 1,600 hours on July 17th, the parachute engineers go to work.
The SGP specialists who dropped with the assault force. They spent hours rigging hundreds of kilos of high explosives throughout the cave networks, the warehouses, and the vehicle depots.
They wired the fuel dumps to the ammunition stacks to create maximum secondary explosions.
The resulting destruction must have been apocalyptic.
General Yves Grasse, in his comprehensive history of the Indochina War, captured the sheer visceral power of that moment.
What did he write?
He wrote, "The Ky Lua caves breathed fire when the sappers of a section of the parachute engineers activated the hundreds of kilos of explosives with which they had stuffed them. The echo waves of the monstrous explosions roll slowly towards the mountains of the north.
Think about the physics of that for a second. You are detonating hundreds of kilos of explosives inside a confined limestone cavern that is packed to the ceiling with gasoline, artillery shells, and recoilless rockets.
The sheer overpressure and the concussive shock waves would have collapsed the ancient stone pillars, bringing the mountain down on top of itself and completely burying the Viet Minh logistics in a tomb of rock and fire.
Tactically, it was a flawless demolition. It achieved exactly what Navarre wanted, a massive, violently undeniable disruption of the enemy's capacity to wage war in the northern sector.
But as incredibly satisfying as those massive explosions must have been for the exhausted paratroopers to watch, they knew it was only the halfway point of the operation.
The real test was just beginning. Now, they had to survive the consequences of kicking the hornet's nest.
Right, because destroying the base is one thing. Walking away from the blast zone before the enemy divisions collapse on your position is another.
The long walk out of hell begins almost immediately as the smoke is still rising.
At 1700 hours, Major Bigeard steps off, leading his 6th BPC on the 23-kilometer march southeast down the road toward the rendezvous point at Loc Binh.
At 1830 hours, Captain Tourret follows with his 8th GCP, and Tourret's men are actively working as the rear guard, aggressively laying landmines, tripwires, and booby traps on the road behind them to slow down the inevitable, furious Viet Minh pursuit.
And while they are forced marching through the humid jungle, the French Air Force pulls off an incredibly daring feat. Pilots flying Westland Sikorsky WS-51 Dragonfly helicopters are actively flying into the combat zone to evacuate the most seriously wounded men directly from the marching column.
And we have to recognize how incredibly difficult that aviation mission was. Operating early 1950s rotary wing aircraft was incredibly dangerous under the best of conditions.
The Dragonfly helicopters had underpowered radial engines and fabric-covered rotor blades.
Trying to fly them into a hostile jungle environment, navigating through deep limestone valleys, dealing with the extreme heat and humidity of the monsoon season, which drastically reduces rotor lift.
And then hovering over a moving column of troops while under potential enemy ground fire. It requires phenomenal piloting skill.
But strategically, seeing those helicopters drop down to extract the wounded provided a massive psychological boost to the marching paratroopers.
It reinforced morale, letting them know that if they took a bullet, High Command was willing to risk airframes to ensure they wouldn't be left behind to be captured.
Meanwhile, as Bigeard and Tourret are marching southeast, the second phase of the complex airborne plan executes perfectly.
The 2nd BEP, the Foreign Legion Paratroopers, successfully dropped from their C-47s directly into Loc Binh.
They secure the town, set up defensive perimeters, and hold the crucial rendezvous point.
By 0130 hours, on the morning of July 18th, operating in the pitch black of night, the exhausted lead elements of Bigeard's column finally link up with the 2nd BEP's forward outposts.
By 0215 hours, all 3 paratroop battalions successfully cross the Song Kai Kung River. The engineers immediately wire the Poloi Bridge and blow it into the river behind them, severing the most direct route for the pursuing Viet Minh forces.
From a purely operational standpoint, up to this exact minute, it is a textbook link-up. The coordination between the assault force, the blocking force, and the engineers is flawless.
It is flawless until the sheer, unavoidable friction of war rears its ugly head.
Because as the paratroopers cross the river and establish their perimeter at the destroyed Poloi Bridge, expecting to see the trucks of the mechanized column waiting to carry them home, they receive devastating news over the radio.
Groupe Mobile 5, the massive armored rescue column that was supposed to drive up Route Coloniale 4 and meet them, has hit a literal and metaphorical wall.
They are entirely blocked by heavily destroyed road infrastructure, blown bridges, and unexpectedly fierce Viet Minh resistance at a town called Dien Bien Phu,
which is 37 kilometers away from the paratroopers' current position. The mechanized safety net cannot reach them.
The elaborate extraction plan just fractured.
Let's put ourselves in the boots of those men for a second. These elite paratroopers have already endured the stress of a combat drop.
They have aggressively assaulted a town, fought their way through a massive cave complex, hauled explosives, blown it to pieces, and then force-marched 23 kilometers through the jungle while constantly looking over their shoulders for an ambush.
And now, standing at a blown bridge in the middle of the night, their radios crackle, and they are told that the trucks aren't coming. They have to keep walking.
They had to cover another 37 kilometers of hostile, mountainous terrain on foot to reach the stalled armor. And we haven't even talked about the weather.
It is July in Indochina. It is the absolute brutal height of the summer monsoon season.
The environmental conditions transform this from a crisp military withdrawal into a grueling, agonizing test of human survival.
The heat and humidity in Indochina during the summer monsoon are practically weaponized. The air is so thick it feels unbreathable.
You add the heavy weight of their weapons, their ammunition, and their radios. You factor in the complete lack of sleep over the past 48 hours, the severe dehydration, the creeping onset of heat stroke.
And the constant nerve-shredding threat of an enemy ambush around every blind bend in the mountain road. You are pushing the biological and psychological limits of human endurance.
It's agonizing. And the chaos of the situation is compounded by a massive, unexpected variable. As the French column begins this desperate march, they are suddenly joined by thousands of local Vietnamese civilians.
These are people who saw the French paratroopers arrive, and realizing the French are now leaving, they abandon their homes and desperately attach themselves to the military column, seeing it as their only chance to escape the returning Viet Minh forces.
Tactically, this is a nightmare. You now have a highly vulnerable, exhausted military unit trying to maintain tactical spacing and security while being completely intermingled with a panicked, slow-moving refugee column.
It creates massive logistical and security friction. The paratroopers can no longer move quickly, and their lines of fire are constantly obstructed by civilians.
This entire agonizing sequence deeply evokes the historical nightmare of the British retreat to Corunna during the Peninsular War against Napoleon's forces.
You have a highly disciplined army that successfully achieved its tactical objective. But the sheer, unforgiving distance of the withdrawal, combined with the brutal environmental conditions, threatens to physically break the army in half before they can reach the safety of the sea.
The victory of the raid is in very real danger of being swallowed whole by the catastrophic attrition of the retreat.
But this exact crucible is where the strict, uncompromising discipline of these elite airborne units truly shines. You see the sheer resilience of the French paratroopers.
And crucially, you see the vital, heroic role played by the 2nd BEP. Their mission was to drop in and hold the bridge, but when the plan fell apart, they seamlessly adapted.
They became the dedicated rear guard for this agonizing march. They stayed at the very back of the massive, sluggish column, constantly fighting off sharp probing attacks from the Viet Minh vanguard.
But more importantly, they acted as the sweepers. They actively scooped up the paratroopers who were collapsing into the mud from severe heat stroke and exhaustion.
Physically carrying their comrades forward, refusing to let the column disintegrate or leave men behind for the enemy.
And that sheer, stubborn resilience ultimately pays off. After 36 hours of continuous, unbroken combat operations, jumping, assaulting, demolishing, and marching,
the battered rear guard of the 2nd BEP finally trudges into the town of Dien Lap at 0600 hours on the morning of July 19th.
They finally link up with the idling half-tracks and trucks of Groupe Mobile 5. The mechanized force rapidly loads the utterly exhausted paratroopers and transports them the rest of the grueling distance to the safety of the coastal port at Tien Yen,
where the French Navy is waiting with transport ships. By July 21st, the entire surviving force is successfully extracted by sea.
When you look at it purely as an isolated military maneuver, it is a flawless execution of an incredibly complex, multi-stage operation.
On a tactical level, it is a masterpiece of coordination. General Navarre definitively demonstrated decisive agility.
He proved beyond a doubt that the French military possessed the capability to project overwhelming, highly destructive force deep into enemy-held territory, achieve a complex objective, and successfully pull that force back out again against deep odds.
But, and there's always a very heavy but, when we analyze the French Indochina War, we have to zoom out and look at the actual strategic outcome of all this suffering and brilliance.
Did Operation Hirondelle materially change the ultimate trajectory of the war?
If we look at it strategically, the harsh reality is no, it did not. The disruption caused by blowing up the Ky Lua caves was violent, spectacular, and highly disruptive in the immediate aftermath.
But it was incredibly short-term. Yes, they successfully obliterated 5,000 tons of weapons, fuel, and supplies.
But because the larger strategic issue, the completely porous, uncontrolled Chinese border, remained entirely unresolved, the Soviet and Chinese supply networks simply ramped up their industrial production.
The logistics train never permanently stopped. Within a matter of weeks, those international supply lines had completely replaced everything the French paratroopers had bled to destroy.
The Viet Minh barely broke their long-term strategic stride.
Which brings us to the darkest, most tragic irony of this entire historical narrative. When you look at the specific men who executed this brilliant, daring raid, you see a massive looming shadow falling over their immediate future.
Just 4 short months after successfully walking out of Operation Hirondelle on November 20th, 1953, Major Marcel Bigeard with his 6th BPC and Captain Pierre Tourret with his 8th GCP would once again strap on their heavy equipment,
Board the transport planes, and jump out together. This was Operation Castor.
Hmm.
And the drop zone they were jumping into was a remote, bowl-shaped valley near the Laotian border called Dien Bien Phu.
They were jumping directly into what would become the decisive, tragically final battle of the entire Indochina War, the battle that would ultimately break the French Expeditionary Force.
So as we look at this entire incredible operation, what does this all mean for you listening to this history? It provides a stark, sobering lesson that brilliant tactical execution and staggering individual heroism, no matter how spectacular or successful on the ground, cannot permanently reverse the gravity of a fundamentally flawed grand strategy.
You can plan the perfect raid, win the Battle of the Caves with microscopic margins of error, and still ultimately lose the entire war.
And this reality raises a very important, highly debated question among military historians. Did the flawless, spectacular tactical execution of Operation Hirondelle actually inadvertently doom the French military?
By authorizing this massive, staggeringly complex airborne drop and seeing it executed so perfectly, did it give General Navarre a dangerous, false sense of invincibility regarding his airborne instrument?
Did watching Bigeard and Tourret succeed so brilliantly at Lạng convinces the high command that they could drop their paratroopers anywhere on the map, even into a remote, heavily surrounded valley like Dien Bien Phu?
With the hubristic belief that those elite troops would somehow always be able to fight their way out, did the narcotic of localized tactical success directly feed the fatal disease of strategic overreach?
That is a chilling military paradox to leave you to mull over as we wrap up today's deep dive. When an army's tactical capabilities and the sheer bravery of its troops drastically outpace the reality of its crumbling strategic position, do brilliant, successful victories like Operation Hirondelle simply become beautiful, intoxicating traps?
Do they blind the high commanders, lulling them into the comforting belief that their elite specialized forces can solve any complex geographical problem, ultimately blinding them to the grim, undeniable reality that they are fundamentally, irreversibly losing the broader war?
It is a profound and enduring danger in any level of military leadership. The fatal mistake of falling in love with the sharpness of your instrument at the direct expense of understanding the reality of your objective.
If this deep dive sparked your curiosity, if you want to visually understand the terrain, see the historical photographs of the paratroopers marching through the monsoon, and examine the exact GIS Google Earth alignments that pinpointed where those men boldly abandoned their parachutes in the dirt to gain speed, you absolutely must check out the incredible immersive research at battlefieldtravels.com.
We have to acknowledge Mick Prichter's phenomenal, rigorous historical work once again. The site doesn't just cover the intricacies of Operation Hirondelle. It hosts hundreds of other meticulously researched, highly detailed battle and campaign studies just waiting for you to explore. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.